Just going to give a little bit of genetics background. I tend to forget, but I guess not everybody loves genetics as much as I do. So you might not have memorized it from high school, so we're just going to go over the basics, make sure we're all on the same page, then talk about MEN1 genetics specifically, how we diagnose MEN1, focusing of course on the genetic realm, and then talk about some genetic testing as well as how to communicate genetic risks to other family members. So, like I said, very basic. Your cell is made up, your body is made up of many, many cells, and in almost every single cell of your body, you have the nucleus, and all your genetic content, the entire code, is within every single nucleus of your body. So every single cell has its own full set of the genetic code, and when it's not being used, that DNA is coiled up very tightly into structures called chromosomes. And then the actual part that is what we call the coding DNA would be what we refer to as genes. So that's just certain regions of the DNA that are the genes. And genes are what code for proteins that therefore go and do parts of the body. Now, I think the biggest misconception about genetics is people think, well, my genes were used when I was developing as a fetus to determine my eye color, build my organs, and that's correct, they were. But we use our genes every single day. Every process in your body is coded for by the genetic code. So all the enzymes needed to run the digestive tract, that's all genes that are telling the body how to do it. And that's why genes are so crucial. This is just a picture of the chromosomes. So when things are all tightly coiled up, they form 23 separate structures, making a total of 46 chromosomes because they are pairs. The thing that genes do that is vital to MEN1 is that there are genes that control how our cells grow, how fast they replicate, how fast they destruct when the end of their life cycle has occurred. These types of genes we call oncogenes, proto-oncogenes, tumor suppressors. They all involved with cell growth. And in someone who doesn't have MEN syndrome, they will, as we all do, go throughout their life, they will start accumulating genetic damage in their cells. Now, this is one cell at a time. Sometimes it's just by chance. Every single time a cell needs to copy itself, it's going to copy its entire genetic code to go into the next cell. And on occasion, the code will get copied wrong. So mistakes will occur. Sometimes it's from getting a bad sunburn. Those cells will accumulate a genetic change, a mutation in that single cell. Maybe it's from eating a high-fat meal, other types of damage we are exposed to just naturally throughout the life. So cells will start building up genetic damage. And at first, it's really not too big of a deal. You end up with one gene that does help regulate cell growth, but you have plenty of redundancy in the genetic code. It doesn't actually cause a problem. But maybe 10 years down the line, you get another sunburn, and that same cell who's already carrying a mutation is going to get another one. At this point, now the cell has a little bit less defense against growing out of control. And at one point, it's going to start accumulating more and more damage, and that's when we have a tumor. So this is a cell that has grown out of control, keeps replicating itself, keeps replicating the genetic mistakes, and now we have a tumor. Because this takes a while, though, most tumors and cancers, if it's a malignant tumor, are going to happen later in life. And what's different with MEN1 is everyone with MEN1 is born starting at this stage. They are already carrying a mistake in a gene that helps control cell growth, the MEN1 gene. And so every single cell of their body, not just one, but every cell is carrying this mistake. And they're just kind of one step closer to the process of growing tumors out of control. So cells growing in a way we don't want. Hence the reason that we start seeing multiple endocrine neoplasia. I wanted to touch on the different types of MEN1. In genetics, we see, or MEN, we see them as very separate syndromes. We really don't group them together. MEN1, which is what I was asked to speak on today, would be due to mutations in MEN1 gene. MEN2, and now we have a new group of MEN4, are actually completely separate genes and different clinical phenotypes, MEN2 being clearly classified by medullary thyroid cancer. We don't have an MEN3 yet. I think MEN2 has a lot of subtypes. I think maybe they were hoping that we just start calling one of those MEN3, but we skipped over. And with a new group of patients, we are seeing a new syndrome called MEN4. Going back to the picture of the chromosomes, these are so separate, they're on totally different chromosomes. So MEN1 gene's on chromosome 11, MEN2 is on chromosome 10 due to mutations in the RET gene, and then the gene that's been associated with MEN4 is on chromosome 12. So a little bit more on MEN1. Like I said, it's on chromosome 11, and it produces a protein called menin. And this is expressed in many different cells throughout the bodies, and it does act as a tumor suppressor. So when the MEN1 gene is doing its job, it helps stop tumors from growing. which makes sense. When someone has a mutation in MEN1, they're going to have less defense against tumors. And since it's in so many cells of the body that uses this protein, it makes sense that people with MEN1 will have many types of tumors in different types of their body. As you've already discussed today, this is rare. People with MEN1 are truly special, estimated at about 1 in 30,000 people will have MEN1, and approximately 10% of people will be the first person in their family. So how that can happen is that when either a sperm is developed or an egg, or sometimes on the level of the actual embryo, so fertilized egg, a mutation in the MEN1 gene will occur there. So mom and dad didn't have the mutation, it just happened in that person, just by a sporadic event. But usually 90% of the time, if someone has the MEN1 mutation, they have gotten it from one of their parents. Now, sometimes it doesn't seem like they've gotten it from one of their parents. Maybe they are less affected. MEN1, as you guys all know, can be quite variable even in families. Some people present in different ways. So sometimes it looks like they're the first person in their family, but when you really dig closer, you start seeing a pattern of certain tumors that could be associated. And when we have a risk of passing it on to the next generation, we often refer to this as dominant. Autosomal just means it's not related to sex. Men and women get MEN1 equally. Basically, a bit more background of genetics. We don't just have MEN1 genes. We have two MEN1 genes. You've gotten one copy from your mom, and you've gotten one copy from your dad. And that's essentially true for almost every gene in your body. You get one full set from mom, one full set from dad. And that's why I put the chromosome picture up here. I said we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. The reason they're pairs is because you get one copy of chromosome 1 from mom, one copy of chromosome 1 from dad. Literally 50% of each your parents. You might look just like your dad, but you still got 50% from your mom. And with MEN1, all it takes to be affected with MEN1 syndrome is having one copy of mutation. So even though one copy of the MEN1 gene is perfectly healthy, someone who has just one mutation will still be affected and at risk for the variety of tumor types. And that's why we call it dominant. Some genetic conditions, in order to be affected, both copies of the gene need to be carrying a mistake, and that's not the case for MEN1. It just takes one mutation in order to have the disease, risk for those tumors. So this is a picture of how this passes through families. So in this diagram, the female mom is carrying what we're assuming is MEN1 mutation, represented by the capital B, and dad has two healthy copies of MEN1. So when dad is making his sperm, he's going to always pass on a small copy of the B here, or the healthy MEN1 gene for this example. Whereas mom, she carries a mutation as well as a healthy copy. So she's either going to pass on her healthy copy, or she's going to pass on her copy with the mutation, 50-50. And that's where we get the risk for the next generation. If someone has MEN1, they will have a 50% chance of passing it on to all their children. Now, I like to say this is like having boys and girls. If you have a son, you're not guaranteed a daughter the next time. It's 50-50 each pregnancy. We all know the families with 7 girls. Every time it's a new shake of the dice. Same with MEN1. If a family is carrying a mutation, if they have a child who's affected, the next child still has a 50% chance. They might also be affected. They might not have gotten it. So each pregnancy, a new risk is calculated. Then that person, when they go on to have kids, they would have a risk of 50%. When you have a parent with multiple endocrine neoplasia, your risk is 50% of carrying it. If you are one of those families where your parents didn't have MEN1, you are the first person to be carrying a mutation. Most of the time, that means your siblings are not at risk. If your parents didn't pass that mutation on to you, in the vast majority of situations, that mutation formed newly in you, and so your siblings aren't going to be able to get that mutation because they don't have a parent who has it. It would just be the sporadic occurrence risk each time, so it just really doesn't happen. But just because you didn't get it from your parents doesn't mean you can't pass it on to your kids. Once you have it, you have it. And so your egg or your sperm, if you're male or female, is also going to be at risk of carrying that mutation. As far as how we diagnose, and I want to bring this up because genetic testing isn't the be-all, end-all in MEN1. There is that clinical diagnosis. And we will make a clinical diagnosis of MEN1 syndrome when we have at least 2 MEN1 related tumors. So where that's parathyroid, pituitary, or a GEP. that would give you a clinical diagnosis of MEN1. And I want to make it clear that genetic testing is not required to give someone a diagnosis of MEN type 1 syndrome. So we think of things as either clinical, familial, or genetic diagnosis. You have that clinical diagnosis when you have at least 2 of these tumors. If you have a family member with MEN type 1 and then you also get a tumor, that's enough for us to say this is MEN1, but that would be a familial diagnosis. So we're kind of basing your clinical diagnosis based on your family history. And then a genetic diagnosis is when we actually find the genetic mistake. We do the genetic testing, we look through the MEN1 gene, and we find an actual mutation. That's when we say this is genetically confirmed MEN type 1 syndrome. The thing is we don't find the mutation 100% of the time. So when someone actually has the 2 tumors, they have a clinical diagnosis, MEN type 1, and they have a family history, we're pretty good. About 80 to 90% of the time, we find the genetic mistake. When someone does not have a family history, they just have a clinical diagnosis of MEN type 1, we only find the mutation about 65%. So you can see that really drops. I'm going to explain why in just a second. The thing is, our testing is not perfect. So when we are looking through a gene, the genetic test, we're doing a process we call sequencing. So we're extracting out someone's DNA, usually from a blood cell, and then reading through that code, looking for a change. The thing is that genetic testing is complicated. There's things called deep buried intronic mutations, which you really can't detect. There's mutations outside of the actual gene region that can shut the gene off, but we're only looking at the genes, so we're going to miss those too. There's just too much complexity that we just can't find every genetic mutation out there. Also, we probably don't know everything. There is possibility of an MEN, maybe we'll call it 3 since we skipped it, or MEN type 5 or 6, other genes that might look just like MEN type 1. So maybe there's other genes out there, and that's why we're not finding the mutation when we look at MEN1. And sometimes people just have bad luck. They don't have MEN type 1 syndrome. They've just had 2 of these common tumors. So they would get a clinical diagnosis of MEN type 1. They'd be followed like they have it, but we're not going to find a mutation because they don't have MEN type 1 in the genetic sense. And those folks, of course, their family members would be slightly increased risk for those tumors, but not the 50% risk of having that mutation. So sometimes those become clear as the generations progress. So if their kids don't ever get any type of parathyroid tumors, etc., then you just start thinking maybe this wasn't genetic, they just had some bad luck. So why do we do the genetic testing at all, though, if we're going to get the information we need just from clinically what's going on and can follow accordingly? It is nice to confirm the clinical diagnosis, as it's already been mentioned today, that helps target, well, we should maybe be looking in other places before we do surgeries. It's just always good to know exactly what we're dealing with. And one of the biggest benefits is going to be to the other family members. Genetic testing, if you actually find the mutation, can be a tool that is used to test other family members and actually say if they're at risk. And if they are at risk, then we can try and catch those tumors as early as possible through hormone testing, etc., so that we really know who's at risk and try and catch it early. A study back in 2004 really did show that there's biochemical evidence of neoplasm average of 10 years before there's any disease. So if you know who is at risk for MEN type 1, you can really start that screening early and really significantly reduce morbidity and mortality because you're looking for problems before they actually present. So that's been proven, and that's why we like to actually test family members who might be at risk. So as far as who should be tested, people with a clinical diagnosis test so we know exactly what we're dealing with. Someone who maybe doesn't fit clinical criteria, but their tumor's suspicious. So maybe they have a very early parathyroid cancer, they haven't had a second tumor, but why don't we do the testing just to make sure it's not MEN1 rather than waiting for another tumor to develop. Let's be a bit ahead of the ball. And then any first-degree relative, when there is a known MEN1 type mutation, they are at a 50% chance of developing or having MEN type 1 then. And there is screening that we would do. And when we know that someone's carrying an MEN1 mutation, we do start screening before age 5. So a lot of genetic conditions, we actually wait till someone's older before we do testing. This is not the case because we can do early intervention in these families with MEN1. The problem is that if we don't find the mutation, there is no utility of doing MEN1 genetic testing on family members. So someone might have a clinical diagnosis of MEN1, and maybe they even have a family history, and so we know this is genetic MEN type 1 syndrome. If we do that genetic test and they're that 10% where we just can't figure out the mutation, then testing family members who haven't presented with actual symptoms yet is not a possibility. The family members are all going to be carrying the exact same mutations. So if the person who actually has the condition, we know because they're presenting, if we do their testing and we can't find it, that means we're not going to find it in anybody. So everyone's going to come back with a negative test. It's essentially become non-informative at that point. Yeah.
But the testing was so imperfect. Why are you assuming it would, just because it wasn't found originally, that it wouldn't be found in the other members?
It's not imperfect in that we get different results different times. It's imperfect in that we can't find certain types of mutations. So these are familial mutations. Everyone's in the family is going to have the exact same mutation. That's what's causing it. So if it can't get picked up in someone, we're not going to find it in anybody. It's not that the testing's imperfect and that gives us different results. It literally has limitations to what it can detect.
Well, when you talk about that, rate of testing, having it, but only so many of them, 60 to 85% or whatever, it will show up positive. Mm-hmm. Doesn't that mean that it's a false negative on the rest of it?
It is, and most of them, it is a false negative, but it's going to be negative on every family member. It's a false negative because the mutation is buried in a part of the genome that the testing can't find. So mom, daughter, granddaughter, they'll all have the same mutation. If technology doesn't work on picking up on one of them, we're not going to find it on any of them. And that's where we just can't have, unfortunately for those families, we aren't able to tell who in the next generation needs screening, and therefore we have to screen everyone. That's kind of the limitation of genetic testing. Fantastic question. One of the biggest questions my patients ask is, how much does this cost? And unfortunately, genetic testing is expensive. On the very first person in the family, if you're just looking at the MEN1 gene, it is going to be somewhere between $1,000 to $1,500 depending on the laboratory that is used. And so we would recommend that pre-authorization is approved. Policies and insurance companies on what genetic testing they cover is all across the board. Even here in Minnesota, where a lot of patients have Blue Cross Blue Shield, there are so many different types of Blue Cross Blue Shield plans, and they're changing all the time on what they cover. So we typically get prior approval before doing any genetic testing, particularly on the first family member because it's so expensive. But if we find that familial mutation, testing for everyone else drastically drops in price. And that's because we don't have to look through the entire gene trying to find the mistake. We know where it is. We already identified it in the person who has the mutation. And so in all other family members, we just have to go right to where it is. Do they have it? Don't they have it? Yes or no answer. And so the cost drastically decreases down to about $350. Yes?
Okay, so I have an uncle who has had the genetic test. They've identified it. They can use his to then look at me, look at my children, knowing.
Exactly. So the work in your family's already been done. We have an answer. And so the testing is going to be much more affordable. And actually insurance almost always covers this testing as well. Besides it being cheaper, insurance, when you have a 50% chance of having something and the testing is so cheap, insurance usually covers the family member's testing. I've never had a patient where it wasn't covered. Great questions. And that kind of leads into telling other family members about this genetic test. For family members who have not been diagnosed with any of these tumors, where all we know is that they have a risk for MEN type 1 syndrome because of their family history, clarification of if they actually have the genetic condition or not is important. It can tell us who needs to be screened and also who doesn't. If someone doesn't have the mutation, then even though they have a family history of MEN type 1, they aren't at risk for it and they won't need these screenings. And it's really some of the best news you can possibly get if that's your child and they're not going to be affected with what you are working towards beating yourself. It also tells us which organs need to be screened, how best they should be screened. Knowing it's MEN1 mutation, there's updated to guidelines quite frequently every few years. Knowing who actually has that mutation can really help us target and get the best screening to that person. It also tells us when, how old they should be, and it also tells us how often. So it really helps make medical management choices if someone knows they have this mutation. Yes?
Okay, so that last bullet kind of leads into the question I have is, how does this affect insurance as far as, preconditions and things like that?
Yeah.
I know it's changed over the last few years, but where is that headed?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't have a slide on it, so let me just address it right now. When genetic testing started to become available to individuals who, especially for these conditions that aren't even present yet. You get a gene, if you have an MEN1 mutation, we know you're going to get tumors in your life, but maybe you don't have any yet. And this started coming on the scene in the 90s as we started finding these types of genes. And people are really concerned, should I get the testing? We want to know if I have tumors for medical management, but I sure as heck don't want my insurance to drop me before I even have any disease. So it was a big concern at the time. Here in Minnesota, they actually passed legislation right away as far as protection against genetic discrimination. And then we did get some national protection in 2008 in an act called GINA, Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And what that prevents is that insurance companies cannot count a genetic test result as a pre-existing condition. Now, if you've already had a complication or a tumor, they might count that as a pre-existing condition, but someone who's unaffected, who's found to have MEN type 1 syndrome, they can't count that genetic test result as a pre-existing condition. And that was where a lot of people had fear, especially when testing young children. The limitation, and also prevents employer discrimination as well. So employers can't drop you as an employee because of your genetic test result. There are limitations. If you are on an insurance plan for a small employer, say less than 15 people, the law does not apply. Now, that doesn't mean they're necessarily going to discriminate you, but the law doesn't protect you, and you'd want to look at your own individual state protection. Also, it does not have any protection for life insurance or long-term care, long-term disability. So that I have not actually heard of cases of life insurance discriminating on people based on genetic test results. You definitely see it being discriminated based on already having some medical complications. But that doesn't mean they wouldn't do it or they couldn't, because there aren't federal policies in place saying that you can't. So they could discriminate on a genetic test result for long-term care and life insurance. And also, GINA does not apply to the military, as most laws don't, regarding health insurance. GINA, Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. Any other questions on the insurance discrimination, just because I didn't have that in my talk? Great question, really great.
Well, in terms of Obamacare, I mean, you know.
A lot of us become mute if we get rid of prior conditions.
Yeah, well, we have. I mean, if Obamacare were repealed in more aspects, then that could disappear, but that seems to be the strongest. I mean, it had the most favorable response to eliminate pre-existing.
And everyone but the insurance companies agreed that we should. Question.
You've seen some of the progress already in some of the important dates. What is the landscape looking like? Not that I'm asking you to have a crystal ball, but
Yeah.
how are you feeling about
Right.
life insurance possibilities and just all those things, and even just in general healthcare?
Right. I don't have much to say about life insurance because I haven't heard, the Genetic Counseling Society follows these types of legislative initiatives very closely on the national and state levels because it affects our patients. And there has not been any buzz about extending this protection to life insurance or long-term care. What we are seeing is that fewer and fewer people are concerned about it. Some of it because of the healthcare law changes with pre-existing conditions, essentially going to be gone in 2015, as long as it doesn't get, like you said, repealed. But so it's becoming less and less of a concern as far as insurance discrimination goes, but I have not heard anything in the work is expanding it to those other types of insurance. Yeah.
It seemed like you were saying that all de novo mutations are present at birth.
Mm-hmm.
Is a de novo mutation the same as a spontaneous mutation?
I was using the same, yes. So it'd be something that you didn't get from a parent. It's something that occurred in you as you were a couple cells developing.
It can't have occurred later in your life?
The reason it has to occur then in order to actually have MEN type 1 syndrome is because it's defined as a genetic condition because you have it in every single cell of your body. It's different than how other people develop tumors where it's just one mistake in one cell that's grown over time and caused more mistakes. So if you have MEN type 1 syndrome, you have it in every cell of your body, which means you either got it from your parents, so it's going to be in every cell because it was there when you were one cell, or it's going to be something in that early cell stages so that when those cells doubled and doubled and doubled, it still ended up in almost every single cell of your body.
So it means you can't have had a child and the mutation then occur in you after the child was born.
Correct. That would not be MEN type 1 syndrome. So if you have MEN type 1 syndrome, your children are at that 50% chance. Fantastic question. Do you know?
Yeah, I was tested positive, and my parents Is it possible that they still have mutations that are sort of like
That's a really great question. It's possible, and it would be something you'd want them to at least mention to their doctors and have someone look into, and maybe even do the genetic test. But if they haven't had any symptoms in their 80s, there's a good chance then that you would have been one of those de novo mutations. All right. But better safe than sorry. And so we typically, even if parents look unaffected, we'd want to do a very thorough investigation of their background, make sure there wasn't other symptoms that maybe we just didn't notice were MEN1 related. And sometimes we just do the genetic test because insurance covers it, straightforward and cheap. We can just say for sure they don't have that mutation. It must have occurred new in you.
Does Medicare cover that?
On MEN1, I don't think they have a clear policy. Most likely the institution would still just order it and not send a bill type of thing.
One last quick question.
Yeah.
Is this something that our endocrinologists can do for us? When we come here to have a kid do it?
It definitely can happen with the endocrinologist's office. It's kind of handled differently in different institutions. Here at Mayo, we're very collaborative. Sometimes families have a lot of questions. My job is literally about counseling and answering families' questions, especially if the kids aren't young. So if they're under 5, I don't have much counseling to do. They're obviously not going to understand genetics. I don't want to spend much time going over that. But sometimes the family's just been diagnosed and the kids are in their teens or their 20s and 30s. And it's a decision that they're going to be making themselves on whether or not they want to be tested and start doing the screening. And therefore, a genetics team might be really helpful in just kind of answering those questions and thinking through some of those psychological, psychosocial type risks that are often brought up with this type of testing. And what I mean by that is, now you guys are obviously all information seekers. I can safely assume you're all here ready to learn about MEN that has been affecting your family. But some people aren't. They would rather not know. Even though it does have some pretty dire health consequences, some people really rather would not know. And especially when someone's pretty young. I'm guessing everyone remembers being 17, 18, 19. You feel pretty invincible despite any family history, especially if you haven't had any complications yet. If they are just tested without much counseling, we actually have seen in the literature that they don't usually do the follow-up as well. It needs to be a decision that they make themselves if they're old enough to make it. Now, we do recommend testing before 5, so I'm not advocating for that in MEN type 1 syndrome. But if that is the story of your family, seeing a genetic counselor can be really helpful to just make sure they're on board and understanding what this is going to mean for the rest of their life and ready to make that decision. We can always do screening without having that genetic test result if someone just doesn't want to know for sure yet. We've definitely waited on patients. We don't wait on screening. We get going on that right away, but maybe they just need a few years to accept what's going to go on, and then they'll have the testing. And maybe they're lucky and they won't need any more screening because it's negative. Or maybe with that positive, they're more ready to accept that bad news. Does that make sense? But endocrinologists definitely can order this test, especially when we already know the family mutation. Genetic testing on the very first affected person can be complicated on occasion. When you're reading through the entire genetic code of a gene, we do find variants of uncertain significance. We can't always interpret what we're seeing genetically, and therefore a genetic expert can be helpful in interpreting those kind of ambiguous test results when they are found. But especially if the mutation is known, you have a young child who needs to start screening, endocrinologists can definitely do it. So I'd say yes. So speaking of family members though, we've kind of proven that there's benefit to knowing you have MEN1 syndrome, even if you're not having any symptoms or had any problems yet. And family members, though, they can only benefit if, one, they know that there's that family history of MEN1, and they have the accurate information to make decisions. And so this is kind of a challenge to you folks of getting out there and letting your family know that you have this condition. So where do you start with that? How do you tell? First, you want to identify who needs to be informed the most, and start with your closest relatives. It's your brothers, your sisters, your parents, and your kids. Essentially, you share 50% of genes with all those relatives, and there's that 50% chance that one of them is that gene carrying the mutation. So those folks are the ones who are most at risk. And those are the people you want to definitely tell first, and who should be offered testing. That from there, you would want to then work your way out. Often, it's pretty obvious in a family on where this is coming from. You'll see a pattern of tumors or clinical features that point, okay, I must have got this from my mom. Or, I probably didn't get this from my mom because she's 80, but, dad passed away young. Maybe we just hadn't seen anything yet. Maybe we should look at dad's side. There's certain patterns that you look for, and you can say, this is likely coming from this side of the family. So that's the side you want to start focusing on. If you can identify which side of the family that the mutation is coming from, then that's the side of the family you need to tell. It's those aunts and uncles, those cousins. So this is a diagram that we call a pedigree. We use them commonly in genetics, although they also use them for dog and horse breeding. It's not exclusively to humans. But this is a graphical representation of someone's family. So the orange people are those with pituitary parathyroid tumors, and then with lighter blue would be someone with a pituitary tumor. So if this is you and you've just been diagnosed with parathyroid tumor, you say, MEN1 syndrome, my brother had a pituitary tumor. Oh, and my mom also had a parathyroid tumor, and she had a mom with a pituitary tumor. It becomes pretty obvious that it's mom who's carrying the mutation who gave it to you. And it's this side of the family, this uncle and cousins, who are going to be at risk for MEN1 syndrome as well. So that's where you start seeing that pattern, saying, this must have come from mom or this came from dad's side, if you're able to. And then it comes down to, how do I tell them? Who likes to be the bearer of bad news? No one really, and this can be hard. And there really is no single right answer. But I would challenge you is that each one of you are the expert in your family and how your family member would want to hear this information. So this is something that you do know what the best way is. You just might need to think about it. And things you might want to consider is relationship between relatives. It's rare to have the family who doesn't have that one odd uncle that no one talks to, or strife between siblings. These things happen, and it's important to be cognizant of those relationships. Also, how does the family communicate? There's probably been other bad news shared. An aunt has passed away. Bad things happen in families. How did that get disseminated? What worked, what didn't? These are things to be cognizant of. Timing of the diagnosis can be important. If someone's just had some serious complications due to a tumor that's probably MEN type 1 syndrome related, maybe this is a good time for your family because everyone's looking for answers. Maybe it's not a good time for your family because everyone's going to be terrified by the information you just told them. You, as members of your family, should have the best sense of what is the best time to share the information. And just be sensitive that different relatives are going to feel differently about this information. Some are going to be so glad you told them so that they can get tested and find out what they need to know. Others are going to hold it against you. It will happen. Others will feel scared or shut down and not want to talk to you about it. People all react differently to this type of news. Just a couple tips. Often in family, there's that central person, the kind of hub. Usually it's a generation up or two. Maybe it's grandma, grandpa, maybe there's an aunt who just loves genealogies, keeping the whole family history. We all have these relatives. So letting that person know might be the good way to just pass the buck. Let them tell everybody. But if they're good at that, you have the family that might be that way. Some people there's that health person. Maybe you have a nurse in your family or another medical professional where everyone trusts their opinion, and they might be the best person to get their help. How do I share this information with the rest of the family? We are finding in a couple actual studies is that the younger generation does seem much more comfortable with genetic information. You kind of see it related to cancer indication. A couple generations back, there was such a stigma with cancer. Nowadays, there's much less so. Pink ribbon campaigns, and since we're in October, there's much more talking about cancer, and we're seeing that in genetics too, particularly in the younger generation. I've had patients who start Facebook pages, send out Facebook alerts, let other people know about other types of social media venues. There's certain ways that the younger generations are doing it. A few other ideas on how to share. Sometimes in-person conversations work well. Sometimes bringing it up at Thanksgiving to the entire group works well. That would not work at my family, but every family is different. Sometimes people just call everyone. Everyone has a different way of doing it. There's also emails. And then one thing that is very common with, if you've seen a genetic counselor, is that regardless, every single patient that I see that's had a mutation discovered, I will write them a family letter. Right? And in this letter, I'll make sure that the basics of MEN type 1 are discussed. I will also say what mutation is, so that someone could take that letter to their doctor and say, this is what I need to be tested for. This one little change in the MEN1 gene. And then that letter I leave unsigned. Well, it has my name and my phone number in case they have questions, but the patient can put their name on it if they want, or they can leave it anonymous. Send it out to the relatives who need to have it. Because you don't have to share your personal information if you don't feel comfortable with it. We have ways of still getting other family members the knowledge that they might need. Some people feel this is a little informal or cold, and again, every family is different. Other people, they like having it in a letter form. When they get bad news, they don't want someone right in their face who is also affected by that bad news. They want time to think about it, to process, to maybe even grieve, and then start asking questions. Again, everyone is different. So I do again want to challenge you that if you have been diagnosed with MEN type 1 syndrome, that you let your family members know and let them know that there's testing available and that there's screening that can help reduce morbidity, as well as I do also want to let you know it's not your responsibility to get your family members tested. I feel it's your responsibility to let them know, but it's not your job to get them tested, especially with parents and kids. If kids don't want to be tested, say they're in their 30s and 40s and busy with life, they don't want to be tested. Obviously, their medical staff is trying to encourage them to be tested, but people have different opinions. I don't want you to feel bad about that. That's not your job. That's their decision. And you should all feel good as long as you get that information out there so that they at least can make an informed decision. So I just want to leave you with that. Question?
I have 3 teenagers. At what point do you say let them make that decision versus me saying you're going to have it?
Right. You're in that weird gray zone. When they're under 5, there's no argument except for the blood draw. The recommendation would be that they get tested because there's screening that we can do. You could also put it, well, you're going to get screened regardless. There's 50% chance you don't need it. Why don't you get the test and, hopefully you don't need it. But I don't want to make light of it because it is sometimes a really hard thing to know for sure. So you as a parent, I think you need to find what works best for your kids, and it might be different for each kid. Some kid might want you just to take over and take care of it. Others might need more autonomy and the decision to do that themselves. But one thing that can help is having them see a genetic counselor or a doctor well educated in MEN type 1 in order to make sure that they have the information that they need to make that decision. But I would say strongly encourage it. So just a quick summary as we wrap up here. So the MEN1 syndromes are distinct with different genes and different syndromes. MEN type 1 is a multi-system disorder, which you all know, and it does have great variability. Genetic testing can be very helpful, especially if we have a known mutation. And that earlier the diagnosis, much better outcomes. So that's what we would advocate for. Yes?
When you get genetic testing of a known
Mutation?
diagnosed MEN1, do you have a specific, how do you put that information out?
Yeah, so that's a great point. I think if I do this talk again, I'll probably put an example of an actual test result. So we're only looking at one gene, the MEN1 gene, and mutations, we actually have a nomenclature of sorts that tells you exactly the position of the change and what the change is. So it's usually a series of numbers and letters that just look like gibberish to people who aren't trained in genetics, but that is that letter and number sequence that's on the report. Usually labs make it bold. That's the piece that the family needs to know. We all know it's in the MEN1 gene, we just need to know exactly where it is and what the change was. Great question.
If there's a young lady in her 20s, just married, it has been diagnosed with MEN1, wants to have children, can you genetically test the eggs?
Yes, there is a process called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. It gets better and better every year. So typically we actually do on embryos, but there are laboratories who can do some testing. I don't know specifically for MEN1, but there is some genetic testing offered for either the egg or the sperm, depending on who's carrying it in your example of the eggs. It can be a great option for families if they're just really not wanting to have a child with MEN type 1 syndrome. It can be a possibility. I will say that insurance does not cover that. I've never heard of any insurance covering that, and it's very expensive. So besides the actual genetic testing on the embryo, you also have to get the embryos, which means you're going to be do in vitro fertilization. So the whole process of ovulation, egg extraction, and then fertilizing outside of the uterus, that cost gets wrapped into something that the patient would have to pay for.
But it is possible to detect it.
It is possible. Question?
I have a 25-year-old, and I would love to be able
To give them a letter to kind of say, here's what it is, so they could bring to the doctor. Because I tell them that I'm just not too sure if that's out there.
Yeah.
Is there something that's available on the website or something?
The problem with a website is you still need to put in the right information. That's why it's something as a provider I give to my patients. Have you ever seen a genetic counselor or a geneticist? They would be the place to start. Call them and say, get me a letter. I need help with my son. They would have all your records so they can make sure it's accurate And they can definitely get you something like that. It's something we're all trained on in grad school. It seems simple, writing letters, but I actually got a pretty bad grade the first one I wrote. So it sounds more complicated than it is. Question?
A while ago, you mentioned about getting sunburns and everything. Is there, if you had it and you go in these tanning beds that have been used, is that aggravated?
It's, in the sunburns, I don't want to say that people with MEN type 1 syndrome are more susceptible to sunburns. That's not true at all. I was just giving examples of how we just naturally acquire genetic damage in our cells. And in general, no one should be using tanning beds. I will just say that right now. Do not use those. They do cause damage.